For tonight's query journey, I asked the keeper of the time portal, what are the primary accounts and official reports surrounding the 1947 Roswell incident, and how have they evolved over time? Here's a partial reply to the query from the keeper from which our guest hosts for tonight's journey were chosen. Richard Dolan, Intelligent Disclosure. Martin Willis, podcast UFO live shows. Let's jump into it. What are the primary accounts and official reports surrounding the 1947 Roswell incident, and how have they evolved over time? Episode 3.
Carried 3 stories about the crash, all of them on the front page. Main statement: the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at Roswell Army Airfield announced at noon today that the field has come into possession of a flying saucer. Wow. Wow. So Roswell is overwhelmed immediately with media requests from all over the world. And just as immediately, there was a decision made from way up high to kill that story. 3 hours after the announcement, Jesse Marcel is now in Fort Worth, Texas, with the head of the 8th Air Force, that's General Roger Ramey. Marcel's got the debris in Ramey's office, or at least some of it. According to Marcel, those 2 men left the office and then came back. And Marcel swore, he said, this time the debris was different. It had been changed. In place of the debris was a ripped apart weather balloon scattered on the floor. Now, the Air Force says that's nonsense. This is the actual debris. So you're left really with Marcel's word on the matter versus that of the Air Force. I'm going to take Jesse Marcel's word on this one. And by the time I'm finished with this, you'll probably do the same. But meanwhile, Ramey brings in the Associated Press. So he's got the whole thing organized for the media. And the AP breaks the story just, again, 3 hours after the original press release at Roswell, that this flying disc was nothing more than a weather balloon. A lot of people forget Ramey also appeared on local radio station in Fort Worth, Dallas. And he just said, yeah, look, Marcel and the folks over at Roswell just had been fooled by a weather balloon. And, they made poor Jesse Marcel pose with scraps of this dilapidated weather balloon. You have to really feel for Jesse Marcel at this point. Like, he just had to take the fall. Ramey tells the press, just a big misunderstanding, no flying saucer, just a weather balloon. Sorry, everyone, for the confusion. Interesting. By the way, now at the same time, there was a very interesting memo from the FBI, and a lot of people have talked about this too, and I want to just discuss it a little bit. An FBI memo dated at that time offered a description of this object and added a couple of interesting details. And I don't really have visuals here for you. By the way, please understand, I do all of this with no production support. So sometimes I can bring in visuals. Sometimes it's hard for me to do that. So here I'm just talking to you about this. I hope you understand. But the FBI memo just said the disc is hexagonal in shape and was suspended from a balloon by cable, which balloon was approximately 20 feet in diameter. The memo goes on, says further advised that the object found resembles a high altitude weather balloon with a radar reflector, but that telephonic conversation between their office and Wright Field had not borne out this belief. That's interesting. Disc and balloon being transported to Wright Field by special plane for examination. So a lot of people have looked at this memo and said, aha, so clearly not a flying saucer. What a lot of people fail to recognize is that this description in the FBI memo completely follows the description given by Roger Ramey himself to the press, as well as to Major Curtin, and that's who's the author of this report, to the Reuters wire service. In other words, they just gave this information to the Reuters service. That's it. It appears that the technicians at Wright Field were very skeptical of this claim that a balloon was what had crashed. The debris that was photographed in Ramey's office certainly appeared to be a badly torn up part of the balloon. How Ramey could describe it as hexagonal defies any logic or common sense. that anyone could imagine. And of course, just how Marcel, Blanchard, and the rest of the people of the 509th could identify this as a flying saucer is an even greater leap of logic, especially there was no disc ever photographed in Ramey's office. An important aspect of that memo is that it said the debris was, quote, being transported to right field by special plane for examination. So somehow this torn up balloon was considered important enough for serious analysis by the technicians there. Now, why would a down balloon warrant such a treatment? So, I mean, I think what's glaringly obvious in all of that is that Ramey released a cover story about what had crashed, and some of that information got into the FBI memo. I think it's that simple. So by the next day, July 9th, newspapers are reporting, like the New York Times and all the others, that the Roswell disc was just a weather balloon. And that was that. Mac Brazel was under military guard for several days, all right? Had meanwhile been led back into town under military escort. And now, contrary to his initial claim, he's now telling reporters that he found the wreckage on June 14th, way earlier. He did continue to maintain that it wasn't a weather balloon, so they didn't break him entirely. Meanwhile, there was a poll among Roswell residents that indicated most of them thought that, well, we got experimental military tests that were responsible for these saucer sightings. A couple blamed mass hysteria, and most of the rest just said some kind of natural phenomena. And I wrote about this over 20 years ago in my first book, and my statement at the time was the Army baked it, the press served it, the public ate it. I still think that applies today. So that was basically the public end of the Roswell event for more than 30 years. It was buried so deep that it was forgotten until the late 1970s. And then in 1978, purely by chance, Stanton Friedman meets Jesse Marcel, who had retired as a major by then, living near Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And that began the resurrection of Roswell into the, well, iconic case that it's now become. Through the 1980s, through the 90s, and even into the 21st century, researchers like Stanton Friedman, William Moore, Donald Schmidt, Kevin Randall, Tom Carey, and many others interviewed hundreds of people connected to the case. I'm just going to go over a couple of accounts from some of those witnesses that I find interesting myself. One is Bill Rickett. Now, Rickett wasn't only at the crash scene with Cavett and Marcel, but he later told researchers that he escorted Dr. Lincoln La Paz on a tour of the crash site and that the surrounding area. Lincoln La Paz, I've talked about him on this program before, written about him. He was a world-renowned meteor expert. He was with the New Mexico Institute of Meteoritics and was assigned or asked by the military apparently to examine the area. Rickett was with him. And according to Rickett, La Paz was to find out what was the speed and trajectory of whatever this thing was. La Paz flew over the area. He found a spot where he said the sand had been turned glass-like, just like the deputies of Wilcox had stated. And La Paz apparently believed that this was caused by a landing and takeoff. La Paz was clearly a believer in the ET explanation of UFOs. A lot of his career points to this. La Paz also apparently talked to a number of local witnesses, and he decided that there had been several objects that came down at Roswell. Another interesting witness is General Arthur Exon. In Exon's later years, he was an Air Force brigadier general. In 1947, he was a junior officer at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, when on around July 9th or sometime nearby July 9th, 1947, pieces from Roswell arrived. Now, Exon never said he saw alien bodies, but he did say he heard rumors about alien bodies at the time. That's interesting. Exon did not say he participated in analyzing the material that arrived either, but he did claim that he had friends who did and who told him about it. And they said the material was, quote, extraordinary. Exon did later fly over the Roswell site, and he claimed to have seen the gouges, obvious gouges in the terrain, and tire tracks over 2 distinctive sites, not 1 but 2. That's interesting. Then you got the testimony of Bill Brazel, who was the son of Mac Brazel. Now, Mac Brazel died before the Roswell case was, discussed in the late 70s and 80s. But Bill Brazel was around, and he offered his own account. So in 1947, he was living in Albuquerque, but he came back to the ranch when his father was taken into custody. So he was there. According to Bill and other witnesses, Mac Brazel's time in custody lasted about a week. And during that time, he was seen on the streets of Roswell with a military escort. You got to ask yourself why. Afterwards, Mac Brazel repudiated his initial story to the press, but Bill Brazel's, his son's description of the crash wreckage was the same as Jesse Marcel's. He said that there were various types of debris, including something similar to balsa wood, but it wasn't balsa wood because you couldn't break it. You couldn't whittle it with a knife even. There was another type of debris Bill Brazel talked about that looked like heavy gauge fishing line, but this could not break. And then there was another type of material similar to tin foil or lead foil, except the foil would unfold and straighten out after you crumple it up. And Bill Brazel also said that sometime after the crash, he discussed the foil with some friends in a bar in the town of Corona, New Mexico.
Top 5 cases that I can think of. And now I understand, and I know there's going to be some, as Michael, who filled in for me last week, said there's going to be some heads exploding. But I understand you don't have a lot of faith in the Roswell incident.
Well, the problem with Roswell is the pieces never all quite fit. I do tend to come down against Roswell. Having said that, I've got some friends that I highly respect who say that I'm wrong. I happen to think that it probably was something of ours. I was kind of surprised. It was actually one of the programs that Bill Burns did and brought in when Jesse Jr. was still alive, and there was another sergeant. They put out several thin films and asked them to come in and say, do you see the material here that you had handled years before? And I absolutely think that, A, something did happen, and that Jesse Jr. was absolutely straight arrow on one of the few people who said exactly what he knew and didn't extrapolate. But they both went in and pointed to, the same material, and it did exist at that time, and it was exactly what was needed for the mission that was described. So,
are you talking about the mogul?
Well, something similar to that, yeah.
So there's things don't when someone is taking apart the Roswell case, there's some things that don't fit either, and that is first of all, I've heard different people's ideas on why the Army Air Force would say that they recovered a disc. So first of all, let's hear what your thoughts are on why they would say that.
They said they had the material as opposed to a disc. And remember, at the time, this is one of the things that's interesting. Roswell was not a big deal in 1947. It wasn't until more than Berlitz came forward with books, 20 years later, that it picked up steam again. No, I had people, again, that I highly respect who knew about the project. The material that was picked up is exactly what was needed. There's an interesting web, I'm trying to think of the guy's name now. There's a professor at UC Berkeley who was involved in those days and describes this in exquisite detail. One of the things I learned from the process that I hadn't heard was that you got to remember the context. This was the bad old days. 47, we had popped hydrogen bombs. Nobody else had, but we knew the Soviet Union was about to do so. Once that happened, it was an absolute game changer from a geopolitical standpoint. And so knowing when they, touched off the first nuke was absolutely critical. There were some things that were learned from World War II. This was a piece that I hadn't heard about. Pilots flying over the Pacific were given little balls that said, if you get shot down, what you do is you pull the pin on this thing and drop it into the ocean. If you haven't been picked up in 3 days, pull the pin, drop the second one. And it turns out there were certain acoustic channels that were in the water, and so what we would do is go and park submarines in strategic areas near where the flight pattern was going to be, and they would hear the ping, go up and pick up the pilot. Well, it turns out the same things occur in the stratosphere, and what they were doing was taking advantage of that. Now, later, our seismic sensors became much more sophisticated and able to do the sighting, and we went to, relying on seismic sensors as opposed to high-altitude acoustic sensors. But the material it needed had to be certain size, shape, and whatnot, and a lot of folks aren't aware, but between 60 and 80,000 feet, there's horrendous crosswinds. And so what you needed was material that could withstand deformation and return to its original configuration, and that's exactly the material that was picked up.
Well, if that's the case, why would so many, well, there's a couple of things. Why would so many people make such a big deal about it, and why would they pick up every...
Well, they didn't. My point was they didn't. Nobody made a big deal of this until many years later.
All right. So many years later, people are saying they never saw anything like, say, the material that they crunched up in their hands. And
they did. The people that we know had their hands on it, did say, this is either what I saw or very similar to it.
Okay. We have a lot of people typing madly on the chat room that I can't
Roswell
keep up with.
Gets me in trouble.
Yeah, but anyone is welcome on the chat room, because I'm not going to be able to read your questions. You're going so fast there. Please call in at 603-967-4030 and have a discussion with Dr. John Alexander about Roswell, if you'd like, while we're talking about it. One of the things that also comes to mind is, why would they fly the material to Wright in the first place? Why would it be that important if the material was conventional to other weather balloons and other radar?
No, not conventional. This is ultra sensitive. One of the things where I totally disagree with Jesse Marcel Sr., in his interviews, he said he was the G2, or the intelligence officer at Roswell Army Airfield, and therefore he knew everything that was going on. That is just utter nonsense. This was, you talk about above top secret. Remember, we were talking about looking for the potential game changer in all of the existing geopolitical situation at the time. No, they didn't know, and I do think that one of the things that comes up is the material being switched at Fort Worth, and I think that's absolutely what happened. And the reason was that by this time people were onto what had happened, and that they knew that the Soviets would be watching television and did not want them to see what the real material was. So I'm convinced that a switch did take place.
Wasn't there these mogul balloons, weren't they pictured in newspapers?
Not then, no. That didn't come along until many, many years later.
All right, well, let's talk about the people, the witnesses that there's like Kevin Randall, who I actually respect him a lot. I think he's a very good...
Yeah, I know Kevin.
Yep.
We agree to disagree. We can have, like with Stan Friedman, and I know you had on, we have respectable, disagreement on, the facts. And I know he's interviewed a lot of people. It is interesting how many of them did not come forward until, like I say, many, many years later.
Well,
by the way, one of the things I do think is important, I do believe that, A, an incident happened, and B, that the cover-up was very heavy-handed. The folks went in and absolutely were threatened. Of course, I was at Los Alamos when Hazel O'Leary started Truth and Reconciliation, and there, like all of the interviews started with, it was a different time. And I think one of the problems, not sure how old you are, but if you remember Duck and Cover and these sorts of things,
mm-hmm.
people today have no concept of what the Cold War was like. I mean, we honestly believe that, there was an impending nuclear strike coming at any minute. And it really was a totally different time in the world. Hard to imagine in today's environment.
But he was the editor of the Morning Dispatch, and he said that he was at some kind of testimonial dinner that Blanchard attended, and they were seated next to one another, and they got back onto the Roswell case, and Blanchard kind of admitted to him that there were bodies involved. Another secondhand testimony, but you're getting into the idea that Blanchard did kind of spread that story around a little bit. So you wonder why Blanchard would say anything about it if it wasn't true, and B, that why either one of these people would say that, especially Chester Lytle, if it wasn't true. So
now it makes me wonder. You're talking. We're talking so many years after. I wonder what things are going to be viewed at. That is, if we never find out the truth in 100 years from now, what's going to be left of Roswell? Of what Roswell will be just like a fantasy story or something. It makes you really wonder, doesn't it?
Well, a myth from the Old West type of thing. And this is the problem that I've had with the case. At one time it seemed so robust, and it seemed there was just so much going on, and we've just seen so much of that collapse. We had the alien autopsy nonsense that didn't help. We had the Air Force reinvestigating. Actually, the Air Force didn't reinvestigate the Roswell case. What they actually did was survey different government agencies to see if they had any documentation about Roswell, which really isn't quite the same thing as reinvestigating the case, and came up with this Project Mogul nonsense. So we've got all of that, and we may be at the point where we may find out what it really was. If it wasn't extraterrestrial, we may find out what caused the reaction in Roswell in 1947 that it got. What sort of thing happened at that time that created this story, and that as we got into it, and I say we as UFO investigators, starting with the original researchers got into it, how we kind of morphed it into a spacecraft type thing. Even though that suggestion was out there, I think Frank Edwards did something in his book, Flying Saucer Serious Business, in 1965. He mentions the Roswell case and a crash. He got nearly every fact wrong, except it was Roswell, and there's a discussion of a UFO crash. But it sort of morphed into this big story, and we were lucky that we had a list of literally 1,500 people who were at Roswell in 1947 that we could go to and see what they might have heard or might have to say about it. But we may find out what really happened. If it wasn't alien, we might find out what caused it, and say, well, it was covered by they felt they had to do this for whatever reason. I can't think of what it would be. Here we're moving into nearly 70 years after the event. What possibly could have happened? What possible secret could it be? What possible terrestrial explanation could it have that we couldn't be told today? It's not like anybody who was involved in it is still alive to be punished or anything like that. If there's a legitimate explanation, we should have it by now. And so I say in the book, you look at that, and Sagan says extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and I look at the other side where Sherlock Holmes said, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever is left, no matter how improbable, must be the solution. Well, at this point, we've eliminated all the other answers. There is no other answer. Can we prove it was extraterrestrial? Absolutely not. Doesn't mean it wasn't. Just means we can't prove it. But there is nothing else that explains it as far as I know right now, this minute. There may be something coming down the pike that would explain it, and then in the far future they'll look back and say, yeah, these guys thought it was a flying saucer from outer space and it turned out to be blah, blah, blah. Or they may look back and say, yeah, it was a first contact and you guys blew it.
Oh, by the way, I have to correct you on something. That was Marcelo Truzzo that actually came up with that saying, and Carl Sagan stole it.
Yes, you're right. Yes. Marcelo Truzzi that said that. Yes, you're absolutely right.
Let's see. There was a question. Oh, yes. How about the June Crane story?
Oh, that's just, she wasn't there in 1947.
Oh.
She had her work history. Her work history is really sporadic in the parachute. What she did at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It's really sporadic. But in July of 1947, she wasn't there. I had thought at one time, given her work history, that she might have been talking about the Kingman, Arizona crash, and but I think now that story is a hoax. So she was a nice lady. I talked to her. I have letters from her. She sent me pictures of her garden, among other things, and documentation. I have the original documents. Other people have them up on their websites. They have copies of the documents. I actually have the original she sent me. But unfortunately, I just don't think her story doesn't relate to Roswell. That's the kindest thing I can say. It doesn't relate to Roswell. Might relate to something else. She might have misunderstood what was going on, but she was a very nice lady. And tried to be as helpful as she possibly could, but I just don't think it relates to Roswell.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you about Chase Brandon.
Why?
Because I've never asked you before.
Another cockamamie story. Yeah, I'm wandering around the CIA and I look in this vault and there's a box named marked Roswell. Why in the hell would it be marked Roswell, for God's sake?
It would be numbered only, if anything.
Well, or it might say Corona, or it might say flying saucer crash. But the Roswell's kind of a misnomer for this thing that came out of, I guess, Bill Moore's typewriter, calling it the Roswell Incident, because, the debris field that Brazel talked about was up closer to Corona, New Mexico, and there apparently is a site or two closer to Roswell where the bodies were located, but it's still quite a ways away. So
16 miles, right?
Something like that. The roads back, even the roads when we were driving back in the early 1990s were really, some of them were really crappy. You go down this road from Corona toward the turnoff to get to the Brazel Ranch, and you come to this big sign. It says, "Road becomes impassable in inclement weather." This is the 1990s, for God's sakes. You can't keep your roads. But anyway, so there's all that sort of thing going on. But this Brandon Chase guy, I don't know what the hell his problem was. That story just struck me as cockamamie when I heard it.
Yeah, I have heard a couple of people that really thought it was something, but I just don't know. I've never really looked into it that much, but I thought the first thing that hit me was, why would anything be marked, Roswell? I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me. But I don't know.
That's exactly what I thought. Why would it be marked Roswell? And then the other thing is, he may have had access to the top secrets, but top secrets are guarded a little bit differently than the other classification levels. You just can't wander into a vault and start looking around.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a reason for going in there.
It's the need to know thing. Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be pawned through this stuff. And that's the thing that always stuns me about these sorts of things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't really make that much sense. A question that came up on the message board a while back. You mentioned Clifford Stone earlier in your books. He is now a controversial figure in ufology. What is your current view on him and his stories?
Cliff is a very nice guy. Mm-hmm. I've visited him at his house. First time I ever met him, he didn't want to meet us at his house. He met us at the Burger King, North Main Street in Roswell. I say that for the Burger King to get some publicity. I don't know why. But so he shows up in uniform, in his sergeant's uniform.
He was retired?
No, he wasn't retired yet, but
okay.
It was a Saturday afternoon. He should have been in civilian clothes. I don't know why he showed up in his uniform. And he takes us to his house. I'm thinking, well, this is really stupid because his name is in the phone book. So, I mean, anybody wants to find him, look him up in the phone book. So he takes us to his house, and we go inside, and we're sitting there. And he says, "Oh, I gotta go. I'll be right back. I gotta get something out of the car." And he goes outside the car, and he comes back in, and he's carrying this folder. This is top secret on it. And he goes in his bedroom, and I'm thinking, if that's really top secret material, you're going to jail there, Cliff. Because A, you're not protecting it properly. I'm not sure if you've got a vault in your bedroom, but I'm betting you don't. And I'm not talking about a safe. I'm talking about a vault. Top secret material requires a vault. When I was an intelligence officer, although cleared for top secret, we didn't have any top secret materials that I had to store. I had a safe that weighed like a ton, but it's not a vault. Across the airfield from me was the refueling wing, and they had access to top secret material.
Names would go out there with their permission. But he was very good at protecting his witnesses. Now, that was a strength and a weakness because it protected his sources, but of course it opened him to criticism that his evidence was mainly anecdotal. Sound familiar? We deal with this to this day. So while Stringfield was collecting testimonies, there were two other researchers back in the late 70s, Stanton Friedman and William Moore. They were focusing on a specific incident that would become the cornerstone of crash retrieval research. You know what I'm referring to. That's the Roswell, New Mexico crash of July 1947. And Friedman really, Stan did a lot of work on this, and along with Bill Moore, and that culminated in a book from 1980, The Roswell Incident, which really brought the case into public consciousness for the first time. Roswell really was an idea whose time had come. And they did extensive on-the-ground investigation. They really surpassed even what Stringfield had started. They interviewed, I think, something like 100 witnesses. And Roswell really went from this obscure event into the world icon and symbol for the UFO cover-up. So there was always a lot of resistance to this right from the beginning. The U.S. government constantly denied any recovery of extraterrestrial craft. They still have. And researchers encountered what I think appeared to be organized resistance frequently. Stringfield, when he first presented his crash retrieval research back in 1978, he received threats. And he stated, many questions to this day remain unanswered about the events of that day. I formally introduced UFO crash retrievals to research, mainly who was the culprit and who made the threats. He was threatened. He was at MUFON at the hotel in 78, and there was this whole cloak and dagger stuff to hide him away in his hotel room. There was serious concern for Leonard Stringfield's life. How serious it was, I don't really know. I wasn't there, but it was taken quite seriously at the time. But anyway, we all know about the government's handling of how Roswell was done. They talked about the weather balloon initially, then they went to the Mogul top secret balloon project, and then eventually they ended up saying, "Oh well, I think we dropped these crash test dummies from the air, and maybe people thought they were aliens." I mean, these are really absurd explanations, all of them each worse than the other. But one thing that you started seeing in the late 1970s, the UFO secrecy was really under a two-pronged attack. One was through stories like crash retrievals. People like Stringfield were digging out, and Stan Friedman and others. And then the other prong were researchers who were utilizing the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, to pry loose government documents. And there were a number of very, very dedicated researchers who made a lot of headway in that. But I'm going to focus for the remainder of this talk on Leonard Stringfield. I've talked about him before. To me, he was the greatest of the crash retrieval pioneers. The man tirelessly spoke with witnesses, sometimes their spouses, sometimes their children, who had explicit information to give him. And as a result, he put together a massive 7 volumes, even it's in 7 reports, I guess I should say. The UFO crash retrievals, the complete investigation status reports 1 through 7. It's pricey. If you look for this on Amazon, it ain't cheap, but I really recommend it for serious students of this subject. The problem with that is that Stringfield really never put the whole story together into one coherent historical narrative. So you've got 7 reports. It's fascinating reading, but you've got to parse it. You've got to piece things together. Because, he wrote this starting from the late 70s right up until his passing in December of 1994. So through the late 70s, all through the 80s, and into the 90s. He was busy with all of this. But keep in mind, the whole crash retrieval story was just being pieced together. They didn't have complete narratives of much, not even of Roswell. And so, he wrote a little bit about Roswell in status report number 1, and then more in number 2, and then more in number 5 and 7. It's all over the place. And that's just how it is. But the good thing about Stringfield is he was a very fine writer, very careful. He, you really can see the meticulous nature of his research. It's very gratifying to see how he put all that together. But because it's a little disjointed, I think that has hindered its broader recognition. It's a shame, but the information in there is overwhelming, and I cannot recommend it enough. Before I get into Stringfield, I'll just point out there are other researchers have contributed over many, many years to our knowledge of this subject. Stanton Friedman, Kevin Randall, Don Schmidt, Tom Carey, Linda Moulton Howe, Dr. Bob and Ryan Wood, father and son team, just to name a few. Many others, Nick Redfern, the list goes on. All of these people, many of them are still alive, put together various detailed accounts on different aspects of the whole UFO crash retrieval syndrome, as Stringfield used to call it. So what I want to do here is highlight just a sliver of Stringfield's work, really his work on Roswell in 1947. Although I'll just mention here, Stringfield obtained information on a wide array of aspects of the retrieval of crash UFOs. Sometimes he would interview people who did guard duty where there were alleged alien bodies in some basement at Wright-Patterson, or someone who knew of firsthand of events that happened out in the Nevada desert or out, somewhere else in the world. About the so-called Blue Room at Wright-Pat, where alien artifacts were said to be stored. Stringfield really, he got these from a wide array of sources. And as you will see, as I discuss this, you will see a lot of the ways that he got these stories make it very difficult to imagine that this was an op against him. Because I know some people might be thinking that, but I strongly do not believe that whatsoever. Anyway, there's a lot of information in Stringfield's work. I strongly recommend it. Back to Roswell, Stringfield spoke to several people closely connected to it, or through a family member like a wife or child. And he not only had a lot to say about Roswell itself, like what happened there, but the aftermath of it, what steps were taken. And so, he's putting this story together bit by bit through the 1970s, through the 80s, and right up until December of 1994. Now, one very good reason why Roswell became the key case to open up the whole crash retrieval subject, because it wasn't the only acquisition of exotic tech. I think those of us, if you've studied this, you probably know this. But why Roswell? Well, I think one good reason is that it had been a genuine newspaper headline when it happened. And so there was a public memory, even if a vague one after all these years. I mean, yes, it was immediately denied, but it did make the newspapers. It was discussed. It was a public event for a little while there. And so it kind of gave researchers a jumping off point from which to dive and go ever deeper. So that's just one reason I think Roswell became what it was. Now here's Jesse Marcel. Jesse Marcel Sr., of course, was the original key to this story. And, Stringfield wasn't the only person that Marcel spoke to. Another was Stanton Friedman, which is very well known. Another is a gentleman who is still with us today and is a friend of mine, and that's Alan Levine, who happens to be the illustrator of my history of USOs, the first volume, which came out a couple of months ago. The other 2 volumes, by the way, definitely coming out this year also, just saying. But yes, Alan spoke to Jesse Marcel. It's kind of a neat thing. So let me just share what Jesse Marcel told Stringfield about his role in the Roswell incident. And Stringfield was fortunate. He spoke with Marcel 3 times, starting April 7th, 1978. It's a really key moment that helped break open the Roswell case. And I do believe that Stringfield was the first to publish anything about Marcel. I think that is true. But anyway, Jesse Marcel was the intelligence officer for the 509th Bomb Group. Or he was I don't think he was the only. He was intelligence officer of the 509th. He told Stringfield about being dispatched to investigate debris found by the rancher Mac Brazel on his property. Many of you know this. What he discovered was extraordinary metal fragments and what appeared to be parchment strewn across a 1-mile square area. And he said, so the metal fragments, he said, varied in size up to 6 inches in length, but were of the thickness of tin foil. The fragments were unusual, he said, because they were of great strength. They could not be bent or broken, no matter what pressure we applied by hand. Think about how difficult that
was. Of staff, Colonel Thomas DuBois and Jesse Marcel with this material that was obviously a weather balloon. Then they sent out a reply that, oh, sorry, we screwed up. That wasn't a flying saucer. It was a weather balloon. So in these pictures, Roger Ramey is holding a piece of paper. And in most of these pictures, you can't tell what is on that piece of paper. But in one of these pictures, it looks like there's some writing on it or something. What some researchers have done, the most well-known who's done this is David Rudiak.
Right.
And in fact, in my story, I have a video of a part of a Sci-Fi Channel special where they go over Rudiak and his findings. But they've taken, good, clear photos, and they've been able to scan them and blow them up. And David Rudiak has looked at this memo, and he feels that you can see some things on this memo, such as the phrases "and the victims of the wreck," and another phrase, "in the disk they will ship." He thinks that's very important because it indicates to him that there was a disc that was found. When it says victims of the wreck, he feels that then that corroborates the testimony from some of the witnesses who say there were, aliens that were found that were part of this crash. So he actually has ideas about what the entire memo said. In fact, I could read it if you want me to.
Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It says FWAAF, Fort Worth Army Airfield is what that stands for, acknowledges that a disc is the next new find west of the cordon. At location or in addition was a wreck, or perhaps he thinks it might say pod or airfoil, near operation at the ranch, and the victims of the wreck you forwarded to the team at Fort Worth, Texas. Aviators in the disc, they will ship for A8th Army Airfield. That part he's less clear about. By B-29 or C-47, Wright Air Force assesses airfoil at Roswell about that or about noon. Some of these words he has alternate possibilities. Said that this misstate meaning of story and think late today next sent out PR of weather balloon would take if photos used in land something cruise. So, I mean, as you can tell, he's definitely not got it all figured out.
But you know, that's a lot more than I heard before that was deciphered on this.
Mm-hmm.
So is this recently?
Well, this is his, not really. I mean, this is as of, this is what he feels that the memo most likely says. He's uncertain about all of this. He's most certain about, like, those two phrases. But, yeah, that's what he feels most likely what it says.
That's pretty amazing.
So the thing is that not everybody agrees with him. Some people have accused him of being biased, and so that has, tainted his deciphering of this letter. Kevin Randall has been a bit critical of some of the areas of the letter. In fact, and this is interesting, the Air Force themselves took a look at this picture and tried to decipher what was in the letter. So in 1994, New Mexico Congressman Stephen Schiff asked the Air Force to explain what's going on in Roswell. Why are people talking about this? And I should explain to people, some people probably don't realize this, but that Roswell was really unknown until the 80s. That once Ramey came out and said, oops, sorry, it was a weather balloon, the public and the press said, oh, okay, it was just a weather balloon, and it was lost to obscurity. Until there are a couple obscure references here and there to it, but that's about it. But then it was about 79, it was the late 70s when Stan Friedman heard about Jesse Marcel telling people about this, and so he interviewed Jesse Marcel, and Jesse Marcel said, yeah, that was not a weather balloon. That was an alien spacecraft. And so Stanton, along with Bill Moore, they began researching and finding other witnesses, and that culminated into Bill Moore's book about Roswell. And then Stanton wrote a book, and all kinds of books came out. And that's when it got huge. Then everybody started to know about Roswell. And so Roswell got so big that this congressman asked, what's going on here? Everybody's talking about Roswell. What is this? And so in 1994, and it was updated in 95, the Air Force wrote this long paper, something like 300 pages, about what they thought Roswell was. Really, I feel it's not that great of a investigation. They didn't talk to a lot of the important witnesses. They didn't talk to Marcel, just used some of the things he said. One of the other things that's important is Dubois, who's in the picture with Ramey.
Mm-hmm.
I've posted this video on our story, but he has said it was a cover-up. He said that weather balloon was not what was there. It was understood by all of us in that room that was a cover-up. Now, the Air Force, in their analysis, said that it was a cover-up, that Ramey and for some reason had decided to cover up what it really was and call it a weather balloon when it was in reality a Project Mogul balloon. It seems like they even question, though, whether Ramey would have even known about Project Mogul, but they say it was a Project Mogul balloon. And so Ramey didn't want the public to know about Project Mogul, so he said it was a weather balloon. Project Mogul was still a balloon. This was balloons they were launching that had listening devices on them, so they could listen for Russian detonations of nuclear bombs, so they can see if there were testing. So that's why they said the cover-up happened. But again, Jesse Marcel says that was not a balloon. I mean, I would have known what a mogul looked like. I would have known what balloons looked like. This was not a balloon, according to Jesse Marcel and other witnesses. Mm-hmm. So, and then you have this memo. So people still feel that this memo could be like the smoking gun to Roswell, that if we can figure out definitively what's on that memo, then we can figure out what's going on with Roswell. And that's essentially, I guess, what Randall says he was talking with his friend about is, if we could fund a lab to do some real research, because, hire some professionals to figure out what's in that would be really cool. And that's when his colleague decided, well, I'll offer a $10,000 reward. So he does say that in order to get the reward, there must be overwhelming agreement that the result is definitive, with the most of the text clear enough that there is little or no disagreement on what it says across a broad spectrum of people of all opinions, whether true believer or complete skeptic.
Now is this the original scan or the original negative? Is that what Rudiak is working off of?
No, I mean, but he has scans of that negative. Uh-huh. And as far as I know, that's the best source if you go to Rudiak's website for the best versions of those images. And I'm sure on one of his blog, Kevin Randall has links to that as well. But I have a link to Rudiak's site here. Well, some people have complained, how can there be a consensus amongst people? There's never a consensus amongst
Good point.
people. So that's impossible. But Randall then argued that, well, remember the Roswell slide? That when that placard was deciphered, with the Roswell slide, of course, was when these people found this photo, they were saying was an alien, but there's a placard in it. But that placard was quickly deciphered by some people on the internet, some great researchers, and they even showed me how to do it so I could do it myself. And we all came to the consensus that, yes, the placard said, this was a mummified body of a Native American, essentially, a museum display. So he argued that, there was a consensus about what that placard said, and that the only ones who didn't agree with the deciphering of the placard were the people that had a vested interest in the photo being an alien. People like Jaime Maussan, who never gave up that it's an alien when it obviously is not. So so I think that indicates that, if Randall is involved with being able to make the judgment that as long as what he determines are sober, credible researchers who have come to a consensus, then hopefully they'll award this money. But and I trust Kevin Randall. I think Kevin Randall is one of the best researchers out there. I think he's great, very grounded, very level-headed. He's never given anyone reason, I don't think, to doubt his credibility at all. Which you can't say for every.
One thing I forgot to explain at the beginning of the show, someone just asked in the chat room, is why is my show Monday night, and why is it later? And I never even mentioned that. So, yeah, it was you.
It's my fault. My fault.
Yeah, but that's okay. I looked at it this. I look at it this way. It's always great having you on, and I don't mind accommodating you in this certain circumstance. So, yeah.
Well, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But Tuesday nights, the 7 o'clock hour is just I can't do it at 7 o'clock on Tuesday nights.
Yeah.
So it was my fault, and if we could have done it an hour later or whatever, that would have been fine. But Tuesday night just didn't work for me. So
Yeah.
and I appreciate the accommodation too, by the way.
Yeah.
Doing this for me, helping me out.
Well, it seems like we have a lot more people on YouTube. Maybe it's a good time spot. Maybe you help me discover something. I'm not sure. Someone wrote early on when we first started the show. They wanted you to, and I think you've talked about this on a show, maybe not the last one, the time you were on before, but what your thoughts are about Roswell now. That's what the question is.
Yay, give me a chance to promote a book. I did a book called Roswell in the 21st Century, which is available right now this minute on Kindle. You could be reading it in 30 seconds. But what I did was I looked at the Roswell case as a cold case, gone back to all the witnesses, gone back to the documentation, gone back to everything that I could find on Roswell, looking at it as dispassionately as I possibly could, and then put it all together in the book. And I think that while in the early 1990s, a lot of us thought that Roswell was a very robust case with a lot of good stuff, since that time, a lot of the witnesses have blown up. A lot of the witnesses proved to be less than candid with their descriptions of what they saw. We haven't been able to find any documentation. I'm concerned that we couldn't find a diary. Somebody kept a private diary that explains some of this stuff. Although Denise Marcel and some of the Marcel family said that their grandfather, Jesse Marcel Sr., did keep a diary, and it's in their hands, and they're doing various testing so that when the skeptics say, well, you guys just wrote this last week, they can say, no, here's the evidence that showed that this diary was completed in the 1947, 1948 time frame. We did find one diary kept by Ruth Barnett, which has to do with the planes of San Augustine crash that was brought into the Roswell case. No mention of anything on the plains of San Augustine in that diary, which was very disturbing, suggesting that we got the time frame wrong, or nothing happened for some reason. Barney Barnett was spinning the tale. But we never found anything like that. So I looked at all of this and put it together as best I could in the book Roswell in the 21st Century. Looked in depth at the Project Mogul explanation, which I am absolutely astonished that we have a document written by the man who was in charge of Project Mogul, Albert Crary, Dr. Crary, who says on the flight that supposedly landed on the Roswell Ranch and explains the whole thing, wrote on the date June 4th, no flight today.
Yeah.
Excuse me, doesn't that pretty well rule out Mogul, I think? That sort of thing. I looked at the MJ-12 documents in depth, looked at a lot of these sorts of things in depth, tried to put the story together at best I could, based on as it is a cold case. So my feeling is it's not nearly as robust as it was. Some of the witnesses aren't as good as we thought they were. Some of the evidence is not panned out like we hoped it would. And when we get right down to it, we're left with no explanation for what fell at Roswell. And I can lean toward the extraterrestrial because I can find no terrestrial explanation for it. But by the same token, that may be a leap that I do not want to take without some better evidence for it. So where we are right now is we've got some very interesting stories about the Roswell case, and we got to look at all of that stuff. We have no explanation for what fell at Roswell. Is that sufficient to take us to the extraterrestrial? I think the person reading the book or studying the case has to make that determination for himself or herself.
Uh-huh. Well, another thing besides diaries, people write letters, and I'm surprised the letter has never surfaced that someone wrote, either from the base, to a loved one or whatever, say, hey, Mom, you can't believe what I saw, or something like that. And
I've still got all the letters that I wrote home from Vietnam in 68 and 69, which gives you an idea of how old I am, if my picture didn't give it away. But I have those letters, and I know my wife's got the letters that her father wrote home to her mother from World War II. Mm-hmm. So families keep those sorts of things, and the best we can look at is Inez Wilcox, who was the wife of the sheriff, George Wilcox, in Roswell in 1947, and Wilcox was involved, and she did a story She wrote it for the Reader's Digest, I guess, called 4 years in the county jail. And the gag was, of course, she was the matron for the jail when her husband was the sheriff. So they weren't incarcerated; they were running the jail. And in there, she put the story of seeing the crash and the little men. The problem with it is it's not dated. We don't know when she wrote it. And it was an addition that she added to the story after the original story had been written. It never got published, but it was, I think it was like page 8A or something like this. And there was this paragraph about the UFO, the flying saucer crash. But it's not dated. I found out that she had passed away in 1989. Well, the Roswell Incident book came out in 1980. So it wasn't like, she could have been contaminated from that source, or some of the documentaries. I think In Search Of did something on Roswell in the early 1980s. So it's possible that she had seen that. But that, we've got that document. It's interesting, but without a date on it, we're just kind of, she could have written it long after the story became well known in the public arena.
Also, when you were talking about the Marcel's supposed diary, it would be very hard to prove that diary is from 1947, because there could be so many, there are, I just see so many different ways people even fake things as early as Abraham Lincoln autographs and things like that. There's ways to find Civil War paper. There's ways to find, 1940s diaries that are empty, and it's going to be a real tough one to prove, I think.
Well, but then you can look at the ink, and you can look for anachronisms. There are things that can be done to validate the diary. I don't think the Marcel family would participate in any kind of hoax like that.
I'm just talking about the skeptics.
But I think the ink can be the formulation of the ink can be examined.
That's true. If it is ink, if it's pencil, then that's a little tougher. Graphite's
absolutely
been around.
But you can take a look at the way the graphite is on the page and things like that to see if it's aged properly. So there are things you can do. The big thing is talking in that arena, the De La Pena diary from the Alamo, which is the one where the story that Davy Crockett surrendered comes from. And the idea, they looked at the ink, they looked at all of that sort of thing, and they were unable to establish the provenance of the diary. So you can believe that the De La Pena diary is an authentic document from the Texas Revolution, or it was a modern forgery, depending on what you want to believe. And so we understand that. On the other side of that coin, we had the great faked George W. Bush documents that got Dan Rather in trouble. And they were able to establish that the documents were modern forgery.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Wow.
And he just went down the tube on. They wanted to believe so badly that George W. Bush had not fulfilled his duty properly, and the documentation that they had that proved it, just the documents they had were copies. They didn't have the real documents. And at that point, you're dead in the water and trying to validate this stuff. And after they got called on it, then they began to look at it specifically. Peter Teitel, who, by the way, was the first person approached by Stan Friedman to validate the MJ-12 documents and believes them to be a hoax, was called by CBS to validate these papers. And by the time he got back to him, he was out of town or something. By the time he got back to him, they had found other document examiners to look at it. But Peter Teitel was originally approached by CBS to validate those documents. So now we got Peter Teitel, who's tied into MJ-12 and the great George W. Bush document forgery fiasco.
Wow.
Which, by the way, I should point out, does not mean that George W. Bush fulfilled his National Guard service properly. It means the documents they were going to prove it were forgeries, and they couldn't find other documents to support the allegations.
Yeah, I think I'm going to attempt to take a phone call now. As I mentioned earlier, I'm on this little tiny Mac computer, and I'm not really sure if I'm going to be able to, but that phone number is going up on the line right now if someone wants to call in and ask a question.
I would like to thank all of tonight's guest hosts as well. Until next time, never stop searching.